Well, it's good to have a backup plan, isn't it?
Oh, well, you need one here. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, great stuff. Right. So if I explain who I am first, I'm Kevin Jarman. I've worked on the IAP program since 2008. Was initially responsible for delivery and finance of the original rollout. And since 2015, I have now been loaned to the Joint Work and Health Unit to look at beefing up the number of employment advisors we've got working in our NHS Talking Therapies services, as they know now. So I think the slides should be coming up. I can't see them. Can others see them? Here they are. Dun, dun, dun. There we go. Good. So that's who I am. If we go to the second slide, please. Yeah, lovely. So when we look back in 2007, when we tested the demonstration sites in Newham and Doncaster, it was always the intention that employment advisors will be embedded within IAP services, as they were then. And initially, the idea was that we'd have one employment advisor for every 8 therapists. Now, unfortunately, when we got to 2015 and we did the IAP workforce census, we found that we had one employment advisor for every 54 therapists nationally, and in whole areas of the country we had none at all. And if we look at the Northwest, the old SHA used to hold a contract for employment advisors for all the IAP services. Unfortunately, when the SHA was dissolved, so did that contract, and we ended up with very little or no employment advice across the Northwest specifically. So I've been with the Joint Work and Health Unit since 2015. Since then, we've invested around £84 million in initially providing employment advisors to the original Layard Clark, one employment advisor to every 8 therapists, with around 40% of IAP services nationally, and we recruited around 400 people to do that. Some of those started in around June 17. The vast majority of those came in either in early 2018 and a second wave in 2019. In the last 4 years, we've seen about 120,000 people start employment support within our sites. And this summer, we managed to gain £122 million over the spending review period, April last year to March 25, to enable us to have employment advisors. We don't use the 1-to-8 ratio anymore. We do it based on the number of people who complete treatment. We expect about 15% of people who complete treatment to access employment support. And what we do now is we're doing the process of recruiting another 700 employment advisors to take the capacity up to around 1,100 full-time equivalents. We expect to see around 100,000 people a year starting in the 24-25 financial year. Right, next slide, please. So why are we doing this stuff? Well, firstly, work is good for people's mental health. It's been found to be cost effective, both by RAND in 2014 and also our own independent evaluation found that NHS, that our project gives even bigger benefits, financial benefits than the original RAND work in 2014. The other thing is we know that people who provide combined employment support, who receive combined employment support and treatment, have far better mental health outcomes than those who have treatment alone. And these are significantly better, especially for those who are out of work and those who are on long-term sick. So we've got a lot of people who were on long-term sick, who we improve their mental health, but also we improve their employment outcomes. And specifically, that was around having people who were able to gain access to employment support and improve, and especially those who, when they arrived with us, they described themselves as long-term sick and unable to work. By the time they completed, they were now talking as themselves as being able to receive now unemployed and looking for work, and that's a big change. And also with those who are in work, we did manage to look at improving their job retention, reduce presenteeism, and improve relationships with their colleagues and managers, which is all very important. Now, next slide, please. So what are the key features of what we do? The first thing is we work with anybody, irrespective of what their employment goals are, whether they're looking to be out of work or in work, whether they're off sick or working, and we empower clients to set goals. Yeah. And then we require both clients, therapists, and the EAs to work together to draw up action plans. We then look to our EAs deliver information of guide. They are flexible because people often change what they want to do, and we also work very effectively with Job Centre Plus and local employers. And it's a two-way relationship with Job Centre Plus. We make sure that our clients are getting the benefits they deserve, and also we ensure that the Job Centre staff themselves are aware that NHS Talking Therapies exist, what they offer, and make sure that they can self-refer clients, support clients to self-refer themselves for psychological treatment. Our EAs work outside of the work area as well. They look in things like with housing associations around housing, food banks, citizen advice bureaus, referring people on to debt counsellors. And also we do train them in money guidance, so they do work around budgeting and things like that. So we do have this impact not only on employment but the physical living conditions of people. And we also employ senior employment advisors. That's a new role we created. Yeah, hold there a second. Really sorry about that, folks. I said to someone at the door, I wanted some stuff. Oh, it's impossible. Okay. So, and I say we create this role as senior employment advisors. So, and they manage the team and also work to make sure that we integrate well within the service and also with the local employment infrastructure. Right, next, please. Right. So, in terms of training, in 2019 we established a training course with Liverpool John Moores University. Managed to train over 300 EAs. They were with our people in our first wave. And off the back of that, we developed now a 12 module training package, which is delivered locally by our services. Training is designed to support EAs to work effectively with NHS Talking Therapies settings. It's not really, we do quite a lot of work around making sure that people are competent in terms of delivering employment support interventions, but most importantly, it's understanding the environment you're working in, making sure that you're aware of risk management processes and safeguarding, and also that you work effectively with therapists. We're currently working with Skills for Justice to establish a level 4 qualification for our EAs. This is just about getting underway. And it is, and we are funding this through the money that we get from our spending review bid. The qualification is hosted by Skills for Justice, Skills for Health, and we're in the process now of completing the work to establish the qualification, and that should be ready by the end of June. And we are currently just starting a programme to provide level 3 assessors training for all our senior employment advisors. so they can gain, so they are able to assess the competence of the EAs who work for them. We're also training a small number of employment support managers and senior employment advisors to undertake quality assurance work to make sure that everything is up to standard. Right, so next slide. So in terms of the next steps that we're looking to undertake, and some of the work that we're doing with around this education space and qualification, we have been working with Adrian Whittington from the NHS England national team, and also we've been had meetings, exploratory meetings with Health Education England, mainly with Naheem Akhtar and Lynn Hall, to establish the EA qualification and to ensure that we've got certain things that need to be done, and they are. So we want HE to support ourselves and Skills for Justice develop the infrastructure to deliver the qualification. Help to identify qualification centres. They could be regional, they could be, they could be national. We need to work with HE to develop that. And we also require HE to take responsibility for the qualification post March 25, when the Joint of Health unit would have completed its work in terms of rolling out the programme and establishing these people within the NHS Talking Therapies services. And also we need to establish a funding mechanism for EA qualification activity beyond 2025. So we're doing some work at the moment to look at how long-term funding for employment advisors with NHS Talking Therapies is going to happen, and we want this to be part of it. Right, last slide I think now. So we have if people are interested in the published evaluation reports, they're available on gov.uk. The person who leads training qualification on behalf of the programme is one of my colleagues, Bridget Lowe. Her details are there, and if you need anything from me, there's my details there. And sorry for the interruption. That's okay. Over to Richard now. Richard is someone who's been very supportive to the programme, and he's been responsible for running our site in North Cumbria for a number of years.
Kevin, before we hand over, I just want to thank you for a really comprehensive overview of what I appreciate is a huge project with many moving parts, and it was great just to get that orientation to what you can see has been a really substantial piece of work. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, it's taken me 8 years so far.
Looks like it was time well spent.
It's a long line.
So Rihanna's just said that Richard and Philip's is going to be pre-recorded. So Kevin, what's your preference in terms of questions? Would you like us to show that section first and then have question time, or do some questions now?
I'm perfectly fine if it's let's do the whole thing, and then I can answer the questions off the back of that maybe as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. That would be really helpful. Thank you, Kevin.
No problem, Andrew. Thank you. And thanks for bearing with me.
Can you all see that? I'll play the sound now as well.
Okay, hi everyone, and thanks for inviting us to talk about employment advisors and how they work in an out service. So we're going to tell you a little bit about how we've made it work over the last 4 years in our service up in North Cumbria. So I'm Richard Thwaite, and I'm a CBT therapist and consultant clinical psychologist.
And I'm Phil Salmon. I'm one of the senior employment advisors in North Cumbria.
So those of you who've been involved in IAP from the start, and I know there's a lot of you attend these meetings, will remember that back when IAP started, there was always talk about employment advisors being fully integrated into IAP services, but I'm aware it didn't happen in many areas at all. And I do remember, some of you will also remember in the Northwest, because we were part of the Northwest at that point, there was a telephone employment advice helpline that was provided, and it was discontinued after a year or two, but I think our therapists found that quite useful. Back then must have been about 2012, 13. So yeah, not many services in the North actually had employment advisors in them. until this pilot was mooted in 2018. And that was where we started to get involved. So I'll hand you over to Phil to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. So in 2018, it was decided that this should be looked at a bit more closely, the employment support within IAPT services. So the Work and Health Unit, together with the Department of Health and Social Care and the Department for Work and Pensions, together put this project together, which started placing EAs within IAPT services to see really whether that sort of practical support around employment issues helped people's mental health outcomes, whether it helped recovery. So almost £50 million was invested into the project for an initial period of 3 years, and that sort of took in about 40% of the IAPT services across the country. What's exciting is that that figure is now growing massively with the expansion that's moving ahead.
Phil, can you remember what the allocation was? Was it 1 EA to 7 practitioners or 1 to 8? It was something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was 1 to 8 from memory.
Yes, that's quite important, isn't it, to make, because there were some places that had EAs, but maybe just 2 or 3 for the whole service. And I'm aware that when Kevin restarted this project in this more robust way, there was very clear recommendations around numbers. But I think Kevin might be in the audience. I'm sure he'll correct us after this presentation. But I think it was 1 to 8 as well. That sounds about right. So some of you who are on social media will know that the linkage of employment and IAPT in some areas has been seen as extremely controversial. And I just want to share some of the things that you can just find on Twitter before we talk about our perspective on this. So people arguing that trusts are colluding with the government employment agenda. People linking in with this idea that it's somehow part of a neoliberal obsession with employment. And then there's a quote at the top there saying that work is not a health outcome. And then an interesting, at the bottom, one of the few people there that actually works now, Daniela, is pointing out that employment support is not job centre work coach. They help people with employment issues that are actually causing their mental health problems, things like poor working conditions, workplace difficulties, bullying, etc. So it tends to be that people who work in IAPT are very positive about employment advisors, but outside IAPT there seems to be a lot more controversy around that. And we just want to talk a little bit about our views on this. So obviously we are extremely positive towards having employment advisors in our service, but we want to be clear on what our stance is. So none of us tell a patient what their goals are. We don't tell them what the health outcomes they should be aiming for is. That's not our job at all, whether it's to do with their personal life or their employment life. It's nothing to do with us. So patients can come to us and have goals that include getting a job, staying in work, getting a different job, leaving their job, but only if it's their choice. They can choose not to discuss work, and they wouldn't even know that we had EAs within the service. But if people want to access an EA, then they can, but they don't have to. They're not pressurized to, they're not forced to. So right from the start of IAPT, we've always seen people who haven't had a job and want a job, and they come to us saying, you know, if my depression was better, if I could get rid of my OCD, I would want to work. We've always had people who've wanted to stay in the job, but mental health problems have been getting in the way. And we've always had people that would like a different job that pays more. So for us, this isn't particularly controversial that if a patient wants to work on employment, whether it's paid employment, whether it's voluntary employment, whatever it is, we've now got a much better way that can happen rather than clinicians doing it in a slightly amateurish fashion. But it's nothing that people are actually forced to do. So point 5 is really, really important. For us, having integrated employment advisors, it's not a form of neoliberal state campaign of control in our service. You know, this isn't us saying we're agreeing with everything that the government has ever done, but our job is to help the patients make the changes that they want to make. And for many of those, they want to earn more money to support their family. They want to work in a different job. They want to get out of an environment at work where they're bullied or not appreciated. Whatever their goal is, we would help them with it, but we're not going to tell them what the goal is. But I think the key point for us in our area, we have not got this luxury of seeing this as a philosophical debate, as people on Twitter do, about whether it's right or wrong, or philosophically, what's the linkage between work outcomes and health outcomes? For us, it's about what the patient wants, and we'll help them towards doing that. So this is very much patient guided. This isn't some form of government imposed employment advice, which obviously we'd be very much opposed to.
So what do employment advisors offer? What is it that we bring to an IAP service or a talking therapy service? Well, it's personalised support tailored to the individual's situation. So whatever's going on in work or out of work for that person, that's related to work, we can sort of work individually around that. The three main areas we focus on are the three sort of outcomes we work towards: helping people to find work, helping people to retain work, and helping people to return to work. And I'll touch back on each of those areas in a bit. So yeah, it's a flexible approach. We don't have sort of really structured templates that we use particularly for sessions. It's very much tailored around the person's needs, their situation at that time, and what their goals are, because sometimes it's not straightforward. Sometimes they could have a job that they're struggling with, and we can help with that, trying to improve the situation in that workplace, but at the same time helping them to look elsewhere for a more suitable job or a job that they're more interested in. So we just try and be as flexible as possible in those situations. And the timely support, when the therapist identifies that someone might benefit from employment advice, and if the person agrees to that, the therapist can put in the referral to us, and we try and get to them more or less immediately. Within a few days, we'll have contacted them to set up an initial appointment, and we'll get things going really speedily. So just to sort of delve a bit deeper of what the help really looks like. So the first session with the employment advisor is all about gathering information, just trying to find out what's going on for the person, what their goals are, what they want to do around work, and starting to develop plans about how we can help them. So whether that's short-term goals, things that need to be dealt with immediately, or looking longer term, which might include, I don't know, accessing training or working towards a different career eventually. So we start putting those goals together at the start with the patient very much involved in that. So a job search, if someone comes to us and says, I'm unemployed, I'd like a new job, how can you help me? We can provide really practical help around all aspects of looking for a job. So quite often we're helping people to write CVs. Some people don't have a CV at all. Some people have CVs, but they're really old or outdated, or just could be a bit more professional looking. So we can help with that side of things, helping people learn where to look for jobs using job search sites. Sometimes people we work with might not have had to look for a job for 20 years, and it's quite a different situation now looking for jobs online, looking not in the newspaper anymore and all that sort of stuff. So helping people use the internet and use it effectively. And then we can also help people sort of identify what their skills are. Often people struggle to sort of say what their strengths and work-related skills could be. So we're helping people identify those and be able to sort of explain what they might be on a CV or in a cover letter or in an interview, and helping people identify jobs or careers that might be interesting to them, that would be motivating and rewarding for them. Also, we can help with interview preparation. So a lot of people tell us that they find interviews very intimidating. We can do role play, we can do sort of theory around preparing for interviews. So really lots of options there of helping people with job searches. For job retention, that's quite different. And we've found so far that about 2/3 of the people we work with are people who have jobs and are looking to stay in those jobs potentially. So that can look like us potentially making contact with their employer, and we only do that obviously if the patient consents to that, and we've got very clear guidance about what we would disclose to an employer, what the patient would like us to talk about or not talk about. Sometimes the patient wouldn't want us to make contact, and that's fine. We can help the person to prepare for any meetings themselves, to speak for themselves, advocate for themselves. So we can sort of coach them for those things. Likewise, if they wanted us to go to a meeting, we can do that. Sometimes it's the employer who doesn't necessarily want that to happen, but we work around that where we need to. Job retention can include providing advice around someone's rights and responsibilities. Yeah, just making sure that people's employers are treating them as they should be in relation to the Equality Act and all that sort of thing. And sometimes if things are getting formal and there's sort of legal advice required, that might be a little beyond what we can offer, but we can signpost people to places where they can gain that legal advice.
One thing that's popped into my mind, Phil, kind of seeing this detail that's been reminded of this is, I think often the criticisms of employment advice on Twitter and on social media seems to imply that all it cares about is any job, that any job's automatically a good outcome. I guess one of the things we notice a lot is that the EAs don't come into that with this belief that any job's a good outcome. It's helping the person get the right job. And it might involve leaving a job. It might involve getting out of a job, but there's definitely no assumption that we know ourselves that there's a lot of jobs in this in the current UK environment that are actually quite toxic. But this isn't about just getting people into work, as some employment services are. This is about getting the person to the right piece of work that actually helps their mental health.
Absolutely. And that's one of the great things about this project, that we don't really have outcome targets. We're not trying to tick a box of just getting someone into a job and then we get paid. It doesn't work like that. So it is definitely about finding what's right for each person, and definitely not a tick box exercise of pushing people into any old job, which has been really nice for those of us who've worked in previous employment support services that may have had a bit more of that sort of culture, directly or indirectly. It's nice to really take the time and get people where they want to be and where's good for them. So outcomes so far, in North and West Cumbria, we've had just coming up to 2,400 referrals to our EA service since March 2019. 43% of the people that we've worked with and discharged up to this date have achieved either one of those 3 KPOs, the retained work, return to work or new job outcome, or another positive outcome, which includes things like maybe a voluntary position or getting into further training or further education, things that are really good steps towards new jobs or better jobs.
Yeah, so key learning, things we kind of wish we'd known at the start that we now know. So staff are before the EA staff had varying attitudes. So there were some staff who kind of recognised the need and were really, really excited about it, but there were some that were quite sceptical about how the two would work together. And what's really interesting is some of the people who are most sceptical are now some of the biggest advocates of the service and refer the most people. So I guess for us, it's not assuming that everybody's coming into this equally excited, but bearing in mind that people are going to have different experiences of employment services, different experiences of how things work together, and they all influence people's views about EA integration. It's kind of realizing that everybody starts from a different place, and what people need is accurate information about what's going to happen and how it's going to work. We found the more thoroughly embedded in the team the employment advisors are, the better the integration works. So, for example, there are some places where the EAs are purely remote or in a different service or in a different building. But for us, we love having the employment advisors in the same building, in the same office, across the desk, bumping into them when we go to get a cup of tea or go to the toilet. We can have conversations. So it's really, really important for us, and we think it works much better if the EAs are fully integrated into the service. So everything that our PWPs and counsellors and CBT therapists do, the EAs would do as well. So they go to the same team meetings where we have champions roles, such as equity champions or drug and alcohol champions. The EAs would be part of that as well. So any project that's looking at service improvement would involve employment advisors. They have access to similar training opportunities. They work out in the same places. For us, communication is really key. And I'm not saying we've necessarily got this perfectly right. We're always looking to improve this, because obviously, as you all know, clinicians and IAP services are extremely busy, as are EAs. And it is something that we have to constantly revisit, is how do we keep those useful discussions happening to make sure the EA and the clinical staff are working as closely together and get them and share enough information to get help the patient get the most benefit out of both being coordinated. So it is really important, but we don't take that for granted in a really, really busy kind of system. So we keep on working on that. And also repetition. So again, because the clinical staff are really busy, we do have to keep reminding people about how to refer, share stories of where it's worked in order to make sure people stay in the room. I mean, there's some clinicians, for example, who could have 10, 15 patients at any one of their caseload open to an EA at the same time, and then there's some that's much less. So there's still variation between practitioners. And one thing we do is we have had kind of data that we could feed back to people and say, you don't seem to be referring many people. Is there anything we can tell you more about it? Have you got any concerns? What would help you to remember? So it is something that we have to keep revisiting again and again, even kind of 4 years in.
So just to share one case study, really, just to sort of put some flesh on the bones of what we're talking about. So this patient came into the IAP service, started getting some HI, CBT therapy. Quickly realised that the patient was really struggling at work, so put an EA referral in. We started working with them pretty quickly into that therapy. So the patient was working full time but hated her job. She was desperate to get out and find another job. She felt very much that she was being sort of singled out at work, and that management, a couple of different managers were picking on her, sort of scapegoating her and blaming her for things that she didn't feel was justified. So the EA spent some time sort of exploring this and talking about it with the person, and it sort of sounded like it wasn't necessarily quite how it was being described by the patient. It was some of the sort of scenarios she was describing didn't sound like the employer was being unreasonable. It was more that managers were trying to address either performance issues or just issues that had come up in the workplace. But the patient was in a place where if there was anything that was vaguely critical or perceived to be critical, she interpreted that as sort of her being unfairly treated and that they were being terrible to her. So the EA had a conversation along those lines with the therapist to see what their thoughts were. They'd sort of identified a similar feeling. So what happened then was that the therapist and the EA could really work together to, how do we help this person to understand that a boss calling out some work that's not up to standard isn't necessarily unfair or them being horrible to you. It's around helping them improve and do the job more efficiently and all that sort of stuff. So the therapist was able to kind of approach that from a psychological viewpoint, working around reframing and how the person interprets criticism or communication generally. The EA was able to sort of reinforce this message, but very much from an employment perspective. So we looked at, or the EA and the patient looked at how managers communicate when things could be done differently, and just some of the practical ways around work and things like that. So it took some time, and there was a lot of back and forth between the EA and the therapist. Sort of after most sessions, they would catch up with each other and just sort of touch base, check in, and just see how it was going. And gradually over time, the patient's mindset was different towards work. She was able to accept that she wasn't necessarily being singled out for poor treatment, and things did improve, and she did end up staying in that role, a bit happier than she was at the start. So really the key point from that example was just the regular communication between the therapist and the EA, always checking in and singing from the same hymn sheet.
And interestingly, at the moment, I've got one of my patients who's also working with an EA, and it's somebody who came into therapy feeling they were being discriminated against at work, and it turned out they actually were being discriminated against on the basis of the mental health problem. So the EA and I did something different to this. We actually helped them. We worked together to help the patient to respond back to their employer to try and address the discrimination they're experiencing at work. So I guess it doesn't matter whether it's perceived discrimination or active discrimination. It just means the EA and the employment advisor tackle it in a slightly different way.
So just to share some feedback that's come in, we send evaluation questionnaires to every patient when we discharge them from employment support. And to be honest, the feedback we've got has been so positive and so lovely. We very, very rarely get any negative comments on these questionnaires, which is really amazing. I don't know if we're a bit tight for time. I don't necessarily want to read all of these out, but yeah, those are just some of the comments we've had, and some I tried to pick out ones where they'd commented on the employment advisor and the therapist working together. So yeah, just some great feedback, and I know that EAs love it when we share this feedback, and yeah, it's really rewarding for them too.
So lastly, key considerations. So, for example, thinking about how you recruit and retain the high quality EAs that you want. So when we started the funding, in 2018, the funding was temporary. So it then meant that we could only advertise the post temporarily. And obviously that influenced retention and recruitment. And thankfully that's been addressed, and the EAs are now on permanent contracts. But that is something serious to think about if you want to be able to keep hold of good staff and get them to come and work for you. Obviously permanent contracts are much more attractive than temporary. We had a lot of thinking about what would full integration look like, and we've mentioned some of our thoughts already, but I guess the question is, what would that look like in your service? And I guess one of the things we spent most time thinking about is how you have a shared care pathway on systems such as APTAs. And I think when we started, different services were doing different things. For on APTAs, we always had one episode that was shared between the two, but I'm aware in other APT services, they went down a different route. I think it's been a little bit more standardized now, but for us, having a shared record works really well. So if I'm about to go and see a patient and I'm looking at the patient episode, I can see what was talked about at the previous EA appointment after my last session, and it works really, really well. It's almost unavoidable that you don't have to look to see what's going on with EA. It's there in front of you. And another thing we spent a lot of time thinking about was how you share clinical risk info and how you manage it. So obviously EAs aren't trained as clinicians, just as clinicians aren't trained as EAs. So that we start thinking about what restrictions would we need to put on the episode to make sure it was safe. So for example, our EAs carry on working with some people post-discharge from therapists, but they don't do that if there's been significant risk or instability, because it's not really fair on the EAs to have to try and manage that. There's a bunch of things that we've done, decisions we've made based on how we make it effective, but also how we make it safe, given those two different roles. And that also comes back to the shared information on the patient systems. So yeah, can you give you a bit of a tour there of how we've made it work? Both Phil and I are happy to answer any questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't be with you today, but we will give Toby and Polly our email addresses. Anyone feel free to get in touch if there's any specific questions, or you just like to know more about how it works for us. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
So I think those two presentations really highlighted the value of getting both the national picture and the strategic look at things, and to dig down a little bit into what goes on in the room and in services. And I really appreciated those two complementary perspectives. We've probably got time for just one question, as I'd like to keep us on time and start our next section at bang on 12. But is there anything people particularly want to pick up with Kevin? There's been some questions already, and Kevin's responded to those. But is there anything in addition? Dale, we'll just take one question from you, and then we'll finish this section of the morning.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks very much for that. It was complemented really well with Richard's more and Phil's more kind of local perspective. I was just really interested in the mention of the employment support managers, rather, because I guess in terms of implementation, and particularly if it's done ICS level, is the funding available for management of the senior employment advisors?
Well, okay, so the employment support managers we have working in the system at the moment are funded locally. Yeah. And obviously, I've just done your MOU actually this morning, just sent it off to the ICB. So there is 1.9 million there for you to spend wisely, Dale. And you know, we do give salary and 50% overheads and on costs, and part of overheads and on cost is actually management time. So there is an expectation that you would, you know, either at an ICB level or through the particular model you're using, isn't it? Is having two groups of staff housed within the two trusts who work locally, that you will use some of that money to make management time available to support the employment advisors to embed properly within the service.
No, and I think that'd be fantastic. And you know, just out of our own experience in Greater Manchester of delivering the Working Well pilot, I think having that centralised management, it doesn't detract from full integration. It just really leads to ensuring that you've got good efficiencies and good kind of minimum standards across the piece. If there's a job description for those employment support managers, it'd be really great to have a copy of that.
In fact, I've got one. I'll send it to you, Dale. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
A great bit of opportunistic question in there, Dale. Both a really good question that's going to be helpful to us, and find out that there's a job description out there that people might make good use of as well. So thank you for that. So we're going to move into the last section, which has got a lot of material to cover, a lot of kind of real expertise and really interesting perspectives on what's going on, both at national and regional level. We got four people presenting over 50 minutes. Is there a terrible echo? There is. Okay. In which case, I'm going to hand over very quickly to Ed. And hopefully he won't have a terrible echo. And I might fix mine in the meantime. So thank you, Ed.
Can you hear me? Great. So I've got the slightly onerous task of trying to summarize the NICE guidelines in 10 and a bit minutes. So I'm going to focus on the elements that are most related to talking therapies, obviously. So let me just get my slides up, and then I can start to take you through those. And just to say, I'm here as an ex-member of the guidelines committee. So hopefully, I can't tell. Can you see the slides now?
We can, Ed. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to say a little bit about what the NICE guidelines have done, and then how that sort of feeds into recommendations. So I can just get this to work. So I would point everyone to the actual guidelines if you want to look at them in more detail. I've put a link here, and I've put some text. I'm not going to go through all of it, which is the detailed process of how the guidelines were put together. But in brief, at the beginning, some a priori questions are identified that we think are important for depression. Then literature reviews are conducted to find relevant clinical trials, which are then examined in both pairwise and network meta-analyses to look at effect sizes. And then we take into account health economic analyses, expert views from clinicians, researchers, stakeholders in finalising the guidelines. And broadly, the kind of questions we look at are questions about what are the relative benefits and harms of a range of psychological, psychosocial, pharmacological interventions alone or in combination across different populations of adults. So one of the key questions was about adults with a new episode. So this is not a first diagnosis, but presenting with a new episode to either a GP or on a service such as a talking therapy service. And one of the things that the guideline did this time was actually split those presentations into less severe and more severe depression, partly to help clinicians make judgments about what would be more appropriate. So by less severe depression, we're meaning mild and subthreshold depression. So this is linked to having a PHQ-9 score of under 16, or more severe depression above or equal to 16. So that would equate to moderate and severe depression. And what you can see from this slide is actually there was quite a lot of data that we're looking at when we're making those recommendations. 142 randomized controlled trials, over 20,000 patients for less severe depression, 534 trials, nearly 90,000 patients for more severe depression. But there was also questions about preventing relapse. What do we do with patients who've had a first treatment but haven't fully responded? And also what do we do for chronic depression? So people whose depression has been going on for more than 2 years. So that's just to give you a flavour of the kind of questions that we pre-specify to look at. And one of the things we would then do is pull together these data sets of trials to look at them in a meaningful way. And one of the things we do is a network meta-analysis. So this slightly scary diagram is a kind of indication of the kind of data that we got, for example, for less severe depression. So effectively what we're looking at here is what are the comparisons in our different trials. So you can see that certain interventions are being compared more than others, and others have less comparisons between them. But the advantage of a network analysis is we can both look at the direct links. So for example, here between self-help and waitlist, but we could also look at indirect lists. So if indirect links, so if we've got data on self-help versus waitlist, but waitlist versus short-term psychodynamic therapies, we can then assume what might be the difference between self-help and psychodynamic. And what you can see is the thicker lines mean there's been more trials, and the larger dots mean there's been more participants. So you can see in the less severe depression, there's a lot more evidence about self-help versus waitlist versus placebo than there are a lot of the other interventions. And then what we do is we take that sort of data and we use that to generate measures of how much change there is. So we often look at a standardized mean difference here in terms of depression score. So how much the difference there is in the intervention versus the control, and the control for the less severe was treatment as usual. And then we're dividing that by the standard deviation of the effect to get this standardized mean difference. So anything that's getting to -1 or better is actually having quite a good treatment effect. And if you look at this kind of data, what you can see is that reassuringly, we're seeing that at the top of the chart, attention placebo, pill placebo, no treatment, and waitlist are all doing worse than treatment as usual, which is good. And then most of the other active interventions are on the negative side, which means they're reducing symptoms more than treatment as usual. And you can see, for example, CBT self-help, and so on are having an effect. So the bigger the effect, the further across they are into the negative, the better. And obviously, we also don't want lines that are crossing into the positive. So if the confidence interval is crossing 0, we're less confident that that treatment is working. But what you can see from that is that a lot of treatments seem to be working pretty well for less severe depression. And that feeds into the guidelines. So this is an infographic from NICE that summarizes what we should be recommending for less severe depression. And it matches pretty well, I think, what should be already happening in a lot of talking therapy services. But there's kind of 3 key steps to this. So the first one, which is a core element of the new guideline, is that we're emphasizing patient choice and matching to clinical need and preference. So talking to patients, discovering what they think would be most useful based on previous treatment or preference. But then also taking this least line least intrusive, least resource intensive treatment first. Again, the step care kind of match care kind of model. And then the other new thing for less severe depression is to not routinely offer antidepressants as a first-line treatment. So we should be offering psychological interventions. And then within that, we've got the cycle where you could choose any of those interventions based on the discussion with the patient, but the data from efficacy and cost effectiveness suggests that we should sort of work our way from guided self-help to group CBT to group BA to individual CBT and so on. So that's a sort of a useful kind of infographic of suggesting, yes, there's a range of options, but unless there's a strong reason to go to a different option because of past experience with the patient or patient preference, we'd work through that option. And I strongly recommend, if you haven't, looking at the tables, table 1 and 2, we think we've designed them to be quite helpful because they actually describe what an intervention should look like, who it might be helpful for, how it should be delivered. And those are actually quite useful for having those conversations with patients to kind of set out what might be the best shared decision making. So that's the less severe. Similarly, we've done that analyses for the more severe, and you can see here that there's a lot more trials of looking at antidepressants versus pill placebo versus some of the other interventions. And then if we convert that into our effect sizes, you can see again the comparison here is to pill placebo rather than treatment as usual. Treatment as usual, no treatment, wait list aren't doing as well as pill placebo. You can see there's a bit more of a range of effects, so not every intervention is as strong here, which is why we can make stronger recommendations for certain interventions in more severe depression. And actually, the ones that come out the strongest are the combined interventions. So when someone's getting CBT plus antidepressants. So that again converts into our kind of planning infographic for thinking about what treatments people should receive. So again, discuss treatment options, match the choice of treatment, clinical need and preference and previous treatment. But here, smaller set of treatments, starting with individual CBT and antidepressant as the first choice, then individual CBT, then individual BA, then antidepressants, and so on. And again, table 2 is a good reference. So I think we're making what are helpful recommendations based on the data, but also that fit the clinical need and the way services are structured with that sort of step care model. In terms of relapse prevention, I think this is something that's going to be picked up more and will become more of an emphasis as we think about services going forwards. Again, this is the nice infographic, so it's a bit hard to take in, but what it's basically saying is after someone's had treatment, do we think they're at higher risk of relapse? And that we're likely to think they're at higher risk of relapse if they've had multiple episodes before, or they've had an incomplete response to treatment, or they've had a history of severe depression, or they've got coexisting physical health problems or other comorbid mental health difficulties. They've got unhelpful coping styles such as ongoing avoidance and rumination, or if there are ongoing difficulties in their personal, social, environmental context. So obviously, we've heard a lot this morning about unemployment, lower social economic status, those kinds of elements. So in that kind of space, we might decide that someone's at greater risk, and then we think, what do we need to carry on? And that carrying on depends on what they've already received. So if they've had a reasonable response to an existing psychological therapy, we would recommend carrying on with that therapy, but with that therapy adapted for relapse prevention for at least 4 sessions. If they've got better on antidepressants alone, it would be maybe carrying on with the antidepressants, reviewing that, but it could be adding something to those antidepressants or switching to a group treatment. And that would be the kind of treatments that often are already occurring. So group CBT or group mindfulness with that model of 8 sessions or so over 2 to 3 months. And if someone's got better on a combination of psychological treatment and antidepressants, again, it's that decision of, do we continue with the combination with the adaptation for relapse prevention? Do we just carry on with the psychological therapy, or do we just carry on with the antidepressants? And then needing to be a review every 6 months for antidepressants. So that's kind of how it breaks down for relapse prevention. So, and that's going to be something that will be coming through as something that we should be monitoring more. How are we improving relapse prevention? And in terms of what the guidelines of what do we mean by adapting for relapse prevention, this is based more on a kind of clinical judgment of the committee, but kind of sensible things that I think most cognitive behavior therapists would probably recognize. So we want to review what was learned in the therapy, what insights were gained, what was helpful, making concrete plans to maintain progress beyond the therapy, So consolidating changes made, practicing useful strategies, identifying stressful circumstances, triggering events, warning signs or unhelpful behaviours, for example, rumination, that are linked to symptoms and impaired functioning, and making plans to handle those going forwards, and anticipating challenges that might come up in the next year or so, life changes, anniversaries, etc., and making plans for those. So those are the elements that we would expect to be built into relapse prevention sessions in whatever therapeutic modality. In terms of chronic depression, so folks who've had symptoms that have been going on for at least 2 years, the core recommendations are to receive CBT or an antidepressant or a combination, to make a shared decision on treatment. So again, that importance of choice and decision making, and in particularly that CBT should focus on those chronic depressive symptoms, so residual symptoms, anxiety, avoidance, and cover maintaining processes. And we've identified avoidance, rumination, and interpersonal difficulties as key maintaining processes. Of course, this has implementation implications. So we need to make sure that service users can express a preference for these recommended treatments and that they're available in a timely manner. And we're monitoring that we're getting quality of access, provision, outcomes, and experience. And that means that full range that we've outlined in those tables needs to be provided between talking therapies, between community and hospital mental health teams. And if I'm going to summarize the kind of key messages that members of the NICE committee have kind of highlighted in other outputs, kind of some of the key changes from the previous guidelines are further emphasize the importance of discussing treatment options to match needs and preferences of a person with a new episode. Again, emphasizing this sort of stepped care, match care model of least intrusive, least resource intensive treatment first, particularly for less severe depression, not offering antidepressants routinely as first-line treatment for less severe depression. So talking therapies is a preference there. And there's an additional one about stopping medication and taking tapering. So I think that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of what NICE guidelines have done, how we've reached our decisions, and some of the key implications that might be related to talking therapies.
And that was a breathtaking overview. Thank you so much for that. We're not going to have time for questions, but people are welcome to drop them into the chat. I'm going to hand over to Liz Kell now to give an update on the PWP curriculum.
I'm really sorry, my phone just rang, so I don't know if you just asked me to start or not, Andrew. Okay, right, apologies. Right, let me share my screen. Please, can somebody tell me if you can see my slides as a slideshow?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So, I don't know if I'm doing something controversial by talking about this today, because the new finalised PWP curriculum isn't actually, the final one isn't actually out, but we just thought it would be useful to give a bit of an overview as to where the curriculum update is up to and some of the implications for practice, really. So I'm just going to keep it quite broad today because some of the specifics might change a little bit. So just a bit of background. So obviously the first PWP national curriculum was accredited back in 2008. Can't find a date for the second edition update, but there was quite a significant curriculum review, which was led by University College London, and that was implemented in 2016, which was the third edition. So version 4 was announced in November 2022, although we are still expecting a slightly altered finalised version in the next few weeks. So once that is out, that will be the final edition. And this was very much just to update the curriculum to make sure that it's still matching what services need, really. So the main changes, so I've kind of separated it out in terms of the curriculum and content changes, and then the changes that will be more about what's going on in practice. So within the curriculum, there is a greater and more explicit emphasis on anti-discriminatory and anti-racist practice. And there's an increased focus on assessment skills in particular in relation to understanding the patient's thoughts and worldview, and that being very much about the here and now, and also around the identification of primary problems in the context of comorbidities. There is much more focus on the naming of explicit exclusions, so including PTSD and social anxiety as disorders that PWPs would not be working with. And there's also much more focus on explicit competence around delivering groups, delivering psychoeducation groups and self-help groups, and competence across all modes of delivery. So very much building on some of the things we've been talking about this morning, ensuring that PWPs are competent in working face-to-face, in working on the telephone, in working on video calls, as well as then supporting computerized CBT and then groups. So all those modes of delivery are really explicitly part of the curriculum. In terms of interventions, the biggest change really is the addition of behavioural experiments as part of the cognitive restructuring intervention for PWPs. I know behavioural experiments have been in and out of the PWP curriculum a number of times, but they are very firmly back in this time, but very explicitly as part of a cognitive restructuring intervention. And they are also specifically around the inclusion of guided self-help interventions for OCD and panic disorder. I think probably some courses, if not all, have had some focus on that already, but it's much more explicit now that what a self-help intervention for OCD and panic disorder would look like. There is also, which I'm really pleased to see, a really explicit inclusion of multiple strands with one patient, and that they are linked to patients' goals. So it's a bit of a technical term, but at times there have been conversations around whether PWP should do single strand work, so should only do one intervention with a patient. I would very much say, having worked as a PWP for a number of years, that we've always worked multi-strand really, because some of our interventions might be quite short, some of them might be much more, for example, psychoeducation around sleep that only happens for a couple of sessions, and then there's a much more comprehensive BA intervention. So it's now much more explicit in the curriculum that PWPs do work with multiple strands where it is appropriate to do so. Obviously, that doesn't mean that they would never work with just one intervention, because that happens lots as well. So then just thinking a bit more about the structure, really importantly is meaningful expert by experience involvement. So it was fantastic to hear Leanne's presentation this morning, and obviously we really need to think about how we ensure that meaningful expert by experience involvement in all aspects of the course. I think there have been some practical challenges with that, just with it being a very short 12-month course. That in itself creates challenges as to how we do that in a meaningful way. But we've already begun some conversations with the Northwest PPN expert by experience groups as to what that might look like. So we'll be definitely building on that and continuing those conversations. There is also the requirement for courses to offer an adapted route for people who work part-time. I think it's probably been a long time coming, and there's lots of recognition that we miss out on a huge group of people who might be really good as a PWP by insisting that the training has to be full-time. A lot of the courses technically already count as a part-time course, so there's some work to be done as to the practicalities of what that looks like and what the timescales of that are going to be. And I would suggest that probably as courses we'll be working with you as services as well to think about some of the practicalities of that and what that will mean for services as well. They have explicitly said that 50% of the course should be taught face-to-face, so it won't be moving to a remote-only delivery programme, that there must be at least 50% on-campus teaching, so that's a minimum of 15 days, and that the clinical skills supervision groups in practice will be a maximum of 12 per group. So I don't think there's been explicit numbers put in before. So I think regionally, I think we're probably normally in smaller groups than that anyway, but that maximum has very clearly been put into the curriculum. as well as the opportunities for trainee PWPs to observe experienced PWPs in practice. I know that's always been an expectation and a part, but it's very explicitly written in the curriculum now. There are going to be a specified number of study days that PWPs will be entitled to throughout the training year. They are different from the current practice-based learning days, which will still exist, so they will be in addition to that. The exact number, I think, is one of the things that's still being finalised in the updated version, so I don't want to specify that, but there will be a specific number of study days that trainee PWPs will be entitled to. And it will continue that the Module 2 interventions module will be assessed by either a real video or audio recording. I think in the Northwest, 2 of the training providers have been doing that already, but one of them was still using an OSCE format for Module 2, so there will be that shift. There's also reference to post-qualification preceptorship guidance. So we're still working through the details as to what that will mean and kind of the responsibilities within that. I'm sure there'll be a lot more information coming out about that, but that's more explicit. And there is also going to be the requirement for all PWPs to complete the long-term conditions top-up training within 2 years of qualification, which is quite a shift from the previous must be qualified for at least 12 months before they complete the training. So as training providers, we'll be thinking about our capacity within that as well. So the final thing really I just wanted to highlight was, I guess, what I thought the main implications might be for yourselves in practice. So obviously the consideration of meaningful EBE involvement, that needs to be within our recruitment processes as well. So as universities, we really need to work together with yourselves in services to think about how we do that well and what that might look like. The provision of the required study days, which I've also mentioned, which are in addition to practice-based learning days. And also the consideration of part-time trainee PWPs and what that might look like. It's written in a very broad way, but I've got lots of thoughts around what we call part-time and how much that can be and what's feasible and what's practical. And I'm sure within services, there'll be lots of thoughts around that as well. And just in terms of timescales, as I say, we are still waiting for the final version to be published. It's looking likely that it will be a requirement for implementation of that by September 24 intake. As universities, we are really starting to work to implement the changes and understand what that will be, but obviously we can't do that until we've got our finalised curriculum, and there's lots of processes that we have to go through to get all of that signed off from within the university. So it's likely that it's going to be in place from the September 24 intake, but again, we'll be able to finalise that better once we've got the finalised curriculum. Okay, so if I stop presenting, apologies, that was a very whistle-stop tour, but I just wanted to give that brief overview to people so that people knew that it was coming and might be able to see some of the details. Sorry, I can just see questions now. So opportunities to access the PWP training courses via apprenticeship schemes or non-traditional psychology degree routes. So the PWP apprenticeship will be continuing as it has been doing. There has been some questions about the technicality of the new curriculum now being matched to the apprenticeship standards, and that's going to be another piece of work which needs to happen. But the PWP apprenticeship is absolutely still continuing. I guess the other thing to say is that there is already a level 6 version of the PWP training that isn't the apprenticeship. All 3 courses in the Northwest and in the Northeast and Yorkshire as well, all the universities offer a level 6 version of the training as well. So they don't have to have a psychology degree. They don't have to have a degree. They have to have a previous qualification at level 5. And that's the same for if you're doing the apprenticeship route, it's offered at a level 6. I can see questions about kind of implications for PWPs who are already trained. Not implications, no, because your accredited training will still be your accredited training, which still allows you to be registered. I think there'll probably be some conversations around additional top-up CPD events and training in terms of the additional content that wasn't necessarily in the training, the same as we did with the POM-B behaviour change for people who trained prior to 2016 when that came in. But the level of detail as to what that will look like is still yeah, up in the air right now until we've actually implemented the new curriculum. So, but I suspect that's probably something also that we might be looking at within the low intensity SIG with the BABCP and, you know, the other CPD options within that as well, to think about what that might look like. I've realised that I started talking in such a panic because I got a phone call. I didn't even introduce myself, and I've just assumed that everybody knows who I am. So I'm really sorry. But I am Liz Kell, and I'm course leader for the PWP training at UCLan in Preston. I'm also co-chair of the Northwest PPM with Geeta. So yeah, that was just a little whistle-stop tour and overview. A lot more information will be coming out, but I know it's always useful to be able to prepare in advance in services to understand what's going to be covered.
Thank you, Liz. That's massively helpful. I really appreciate that. And my apologies for not introducing you. I could have done that just as well as you can, but you do need no introduction. I think it's probably fair to say. But thank you.
I don't know if that's good or bad, Andrew.
It's both, you know, but mainly good. So thank you. That was incredibly helpful. And thanks for picking up those questions as well. Toby, we're running right on time, which is great. And you got just over 10 minutes, 11 minutes to give us a kind of overview and introduction to the work you've been involved with the counselling pilot, and then we'll hear from David around the mandatory training on autism project, and then we'll bring things to a close. So Toby, over to you.
I'm hoping Matthew's actually going to go first, but either way,
yeah,
it probably makes more sense for you to go first, Matthew.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, Toby. So before I start, is everybody able to see me and hear me? Because that's always a good start. Yeah, good.
Spot on.
Fabulous. So I'll just pop up my slides really quickly. Is everybody able to see that as a slideshow? Fabulous. Right. Okay, so yeah, before I get started, so my name is Matthew Oates. I'm a project manager at now NHS England, so formerly Health Education England, and I lead on the Talking Therapies high intensity psychotherapeutic counselling pilot for the Talking Therapies team in the National Mental Health Programme. So yeah, come along today just to give you a bit of an update in terms of where we are with the pilot. Hopefully you've heard about it before. And then I think Toby's going to give you a bit of a service perspective in terms of how things have gone. So yeah, a bit of context to start with. So the high intensity psychotherapeutic counselling pilot came about as a way to establish a new training pathway for the psychological professions into the Talking Therapies workforce. So it was linked really to two main policy drivers, obviously the NHS long-term plan and the Psychological Professions Workforce Plan for England. So the intention really was to look at how we could encourage and seek additional members in workforce in terms of the Talking Therapies workforce that perhaps we wouldn't have got through other courses. And ultimately it was there to try and support the NHS to expand the range of quality and evidence-based psychological therapies available through Talking Therapies. So the pilot, we started, well, when we say we, I wasn't involved at this point, but the pilot sort of started about 2 or 3 years ago initially with the development of the high intensity psychotherapeutic counselling curriculum. So that was developed through an expert reference group by Health Education England, and I think was completed in around 2021. So once we had the curriculum in place, we then went through a process of procurement to begin delivery. And so it's a 3-year programme. So year 1's a foundation year, and year 2 and 3, the trainees get specific modality training. So following procurement, we commissioned 3 providers to deliver the pathway. So they started in September 2022. So we've got Metanoia Institute, who are delivering the counselling for depression pathway. We've got University of Roehampton, who are delivering the dynamic interpersonal therapy pathway, and Tavistock Relationships, who are delivering the couples therapy for depression. So as I mentioned, they all started in September 2022. So NHS England is part of the pilot funding. So we're funding the course fees, and we're also funding 100% of salary support across the 3 years to the services that have trainees. So after a period of quite intense recruitment, which I'll touch on a bit later in terms of some of the challenges that we had, we ended up with 47 trainees from across England who started in September 22. We originally intended to aim for 60, so unfortunately we didn't quite meet that original aim. So I'll touch on that a bit later in terms of some of the challenges, but I've just given a bit of a breakdown there in terms of what that looks like across the 3 pathways. And then just in terms of a bit of relevance to this meeting, I just wanted to give a bit of a breakdown in terms of the North and what that looks like. So we have 6 trainees from the North East Yorkshire and Humber region, and we have 1 trainee from the North West region. So yeah, so obviously we're in the middle of delivery at the moment. Term 1 was completed at the end of last year, and term 2 started and just coming to the end of now. Or actually, no, term 2 is finished, and they're just going into term 3 following Easter. Alongside, obviously, the delivery, we've also been working on the accreditation of the pilot. So we've worked with the ScopeAid partnership. So that's the partnership of the various different counselling professional bodies to develop an accreditation proposal. So that's now been approved by our various government group organisations and groups. And the intention is for a ScopeAid partnership to start the accreditation process with a desktop exercise, and also they're doing some planned visits as well to the training programmes from April. So as we've gone into sort of term 2 and term 3, I thought it'd be helpful just to have a bit of a think about what's worked well so far. We're still fairly early in, I suppose, in the pilot process, but we sort of already started to think about evaluation and obviously next steps as well, which I'll also touch on. So yeah, the first thing, I think we've had excellent engagement from the training providers. So across all 3 providers, I think they've really taken up this opportunity to deliver the pilot really well, and you know, have engaged with us throughout that process. And again, we've had that from the services as well. Obviously, given the nature of it as a pilot, we've had some challenges in terms of some of the realities of delivery, especially compared to some of the information that was originally in the curriculum. But yeah, we've had excellent engagement both from the training providers and the services. We've had good retention of trainees through year 1. So we started with 47, and we've still got 47 trainees, which is great. And we've also worked through a process sort of coming towards the end of term 1 into term 2, where trainees have been able to start supervised practice as well, which has been great. And then I put there at the end as something that worked well, but also talk about something that we had challenges with was just around the rapid mobilisation. I think both in terms of the engagement we had from services and the training providers did turn the sort of recruitment process and the mobilisation process around really quickly, and all that was challenging. I think it was really appreciated from our end in terms of the amount of engagement and support we had from them. So yeah, some of the challenges. So yeah, I've mentioned it a couple of times. Rapid mobilisation. Although you know, we got a lot of support from the training programme and the training programme and the services. As I said, we intended originally to have 60 trainees. We only ended up with 47. So there's clearly something we need to look at there, both in terms of the recruitment processes, both around timings, but also potentially more widely in terms of I suppose how we advertised and how we recruited, just to try to understand why we were able to meet the original goal of 60 trainees. So yeah, it's because of the way we've procured it, because it's a fairly small pilot. We did it as a national scheme. So through the procurement, we ended up, and I'm sure those that know those 3 providers and recognise those names will recognise the fact that they're all London based. So yeah, we've had some challenges just in terms of face-to-face and remote delivery, and I suppose the balance between the 2. And also just thinking about the training and recruitment numbers, I think there's potentially something there around the impact, particularly for the North region, per se, in terms of what that London delivery has meant around the amount of trainees we've been able to to get from northern regions. And then just the last bit, really, something that we're continually working through is just really in terms of curriculum and potentially not always being reflective in terms of the realities of delivery, especially given the fact it's a pilot. So quickly before I hand over to Toby, just to give a service perspective. So what next? So yeah, we're continuing to support the pilot into years 2 and 3, and as part of that, we'll continue to proactively support the services and the training programs, including through regular curriculum reviews and also an input into the accreditation process. The next sort of big piece of work that's likely to kick off that we've just received approval for funding for is the evaluation for the scheme. So the intention is for us to commission an external evaluation provider to help with that. So again, it'd be looking at things, obviously impact for services, service users and trainees as well, and then looking at sort of both the beginning of the pilot in terms of recruitment, and then going back to the very start in terms of the intention of why we started this pilot in the first place, to understand if it has had that impact on widening and expanding the talking therapies workforce. And then leading on from that, obviously we've done this as a pilot to learn from and to obviously guide any future commissioning decisions. So there's obviously further work to be done then once we've got some of the outcomes from the evaluation in terms of what comes next. And I've just listed off a few obviously key policy changes and drivers that are coming up. So the psychological professions workforce plan refresh, the long-term workforce plan, and how this pilot fits into any future talking therapist expansion. So that's it from me. I'll hand over to Toby now. I think it's going to take you through a bit of a service perspective, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards as well.
Thank you, Matthew. That was massively helpful. Toby, I'm just going to do a little bit of timekeeping and remind you that you've probably got about 3 minutes. So I hope that's long enough to do justice to what you want to say. I'm sorry it's a little bit tight.
Can you give me 4, Andrew? Because I'm just conscious there's a couple of questions that have come up in the chat that actually I could probably just say a little bit more about, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
I'll be as brief as I can. Can you see my slides if I go into a slideshow? Does that work? Cool. Right. So yeah, thanks. So my intention really, I guess, was to follow Matthew and give a bit of a service perspective about really why we wanted to be involved in this pilot program and kind of how it's gone. Just to introduce myself, I'm the Chief Exec at Sunderland Counselling Service. I also am the clinical lead for North East North Cumbria for NHS Talking Therapies, and I do quite a bit of work with BACP as well. So that probably starts to set the scene. But from an organisational point of view, I guess we were really keen to be part of this pilot. I mean, obviously our name is Sunderland Counselling Service, so counselling is a lot of what we do, but actually we do some other stuff as well. But I guess specifically we're part of 4 NHS talking therapy services in the North East, being Sunderland, Northumberland, North Tyneside and the County Durham and Darlington services. And in those services we tend to focus on low intensity CBT in a couple of the services, but quite a lot of counselling for depression, step 3 counselling work across all of those services. In addition to that, we have some non-NHS talking therapy services, I guess services that you might see as more sort of traditional voluntary sector services. So bereavement counselling, counselling for victims and survivors of sexual violence, etc. I'm not going to go through every bullet point because I'm pushed for time, but I guess a key point from our point of view really is that, you know, we've been around for 40 years. We've delivered counselling services, both NHS and non-NHS for 40 years. So we're kind of well embedded in the traditional counselling training routes, and we've always been a placement provider for counselling trainees. So I guess we understand some of the difficulties really around that traditional training route where counsellors pay for their own training. And then in latter years being part of NHS commission services, of employing qualified counsellors and then supporting them through the talking therapies compliant CFD training, typically at York St John, given where we are. Are my slides changing, by the way, Andrew? Yeah, cool. So yeah, the pilot. So we were involved from the outset, actually. Matthew referenced the project group and the curriculum development group. And so we were involved right from the get-go, really. And the intention of that really was to have some service perspective in that project development group and the curriculum development group. And I guess from our point of view, really, we see this as a hugely significant development for counselling as a profession, given the previous training models where students were paying for their own course fees, they were working voluntarily, typically in the voluntary sector, to accrue their hours to enable us to complete their courses, etc. So actually for us, the possibility of a 3-year salaried training programme, which would hopefully will produce Talking Therapies counsellors at the end of it, seems really positive. So just to quickly pick up a couple of the questions from the chat, the entry requirement for level 1 was a level 2 counselling qualification. Essentially, year 1 is broadly speaking comparable to the old diploma or foundation level counselling training, which would typically be 2 years. So that's kind of condensed into 1 year. Trainees need to gain 100 hours of supervised practice during that first year. Years 2 and 3 then essentially get them to honours degree level, plus the Talking Therapies top-up CFD, plus being accreditable by a relevant professional body. And by the end of the 3 years, they need to have got 450 supervised hours. So we're not taking people from elsewhere in Talking Therapy services. The idea, as Matthew I think has hinted at, is this is trying to get people into the workforce who might not otherwise be able to train as counsellors, partly for financial reasons. So really it's about trying to, widen the access to counselling training. One part of a long-term solution to the recruitment challenges that we see across all of our modalities in Talking Therapy services. So for all of those reasons, we were absolutely dead keen to be involved as a placement setting. We were allocated 4 trainees, and I realise from what Matthew said is that we've got 4 of the 6 in the Northeast, and we've based those in the Durham and Darlington service, and they're all going through the PCET CFD pathway at Metanoia. The reason we based them in the Durham and Darlington service is that service already had. Oh, Andrew.
Just 1 more minute, please, Toby.
Right.
I know I could get a good hour of this because it's really important stuff.
Yeah, and
but,
sorry, I will.
It's a tight timetable.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that it had a non-IAP pathway for low risk, below caseness clients, so very trainee suitable. Trainees now in the 2nd term, working with clients. Into the 2nd year, they'll start seeing again trainee suitable step 3 clients. The remote face-to-face split, as Matthew said, has been an interesting one. So Metanoia have worked really hard to make sure that there are quite condensed blocks of face-to-face training at the start and the end of each term, with online training in between times. And okay, that means some additional cost in terms of travel and accommodation, etc. But actually, as a way of balancing it, it seems to work reasonably well. My last slide was really just some quotes from some of our trainees themselves, and you can read those yourselves if you want, and we'll circulate them. But really, it for me emphasizes the point that we are getting people into the profession that otherwise might not have been able to do so, which for me is the value. And I would say any questions, but Andrew's going to tell me I haven't got time, so I'm going to stop sharing.
You have got time in the chat, Toby, because I think that both of those presentations on this really exciting development are going to raise a lot of questions for a lot of services. Mainly, I suspect, how can we get in on this? Because it sounds like a fantastic program, and I think a lot of people will be very interested in participating as we move forward, and have shown in the pilot that it can genuinely work. So thank you very much for that. So in the last sort of 10 or 15 minutes, David van der Velde's going to present on a really timely topic and one that's getting a lot of national traction, really. So it's an absolute pleasure to invite David to speak to us now about developments in terms of the training on autism awareness that's been rolled out across the NHS. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. And unfortunately, I've been given the graveyard shift and I have such a small time in order to encapsulate what we're doing at Oliver McGowan. So I will do my best. If you have more questions, you can always email me. So my name's David van der Velde. I'm the regional lead for learning disability and autism workforce. So I work in the commissioning and education transformation team now in the new NHS England. Let me just share my slides. Please let me know if you can see that. Yeah, is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. So if you can see that, that's fine. So Oliver McGowan, what is it? So I hope you all know or have an idea of what it is. So Oliver was unfortunately someone who passed away due to negligent care. As a direct result of a lack of understanding around his diagnosis, but also what his needs were. He was given antipsychotic medication when he shouldn't have been. It's a very long story. If you Google Oliver McGowan, you can listen to the story on YouTube. But what's come out of that is that happened a few years ago, and actually Oliver's mom has been campaigning relentlessly to bring a change to the law, which he's managed to do. We've now created mandatory training, so trusts have to provide autism awareness training and learning disability awareness training, tiered training specific to role. That's the statement from the CQC at the moment. The standards for the training are still being developed, and they will be coming out later this year, hopefully by the end of the summer. That will say in the standards that this training that I'm showing you now, Oliver McGowan, will be the preferred training across the country. So we are rolling out in the Northwest. We were given £1 million, and I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of how we spent the money. So this is Oliver, or this was Oliver, and this is the campaign. So briefly, what is it? We've got 2 tiers. There's no tier 3. So we've got tier 1 and tier 2. Everyone at the moment, no matter where you are, you can go on your computer now and you can complete e-learning on e-learning for health platform. And that will give you the part A of either tier 1 or tier 2. So it's an e-learning module you can complete within your own time. It takes about 90 minutes. And then based on whether or not you provide direct care or not, now we have guidance on how to divide your staff into tier 1 and tier 2. You will either do tier 1, which is an online interactive session, or tier 2, which is a 1-day face-to-face training, and that will probably be more appropriate for clinical staff. So if you were to think about a typical hospital organisation, they'd be looking at a 20% tier 1, 80% tier 2 sort of breakdown, if that's helpful.
Before you move on, could you enlarge that slide, please? I'm finding it really hard to read the tiny print.
Wait, let me see if that's working. Let me try that again. Yeah, let's try that again. This should work now.
You just press slideshow, David, that'll make it larger.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I pressed slideshow, but let me see if I can share it slightly different. Ah, there we go. Yes, brilliant. So let's see. Can you see that now?
Yes, that's better. Thank you very much.
Okay, brilliant. So this is the kind of makeup. And then, so what did we do? We got given £1 million each for each of the regions. So I lead on this for the Northwest region. We got given £1 million, and what we did was we scoped NHS organisations and we asked them, would you like to be involved, yes or no? On that basis, we then picked a selection. We chose 7, 2 in each ICB and then our ambulance service. And we wanted a real mix. So as you can see, there is a sort of an independent autism training centre. There is a specialist hospital, there's a general hospital, there's community, there's mental health community, etc. So we wanted to just try it for phase 1, and we split the money based on weighted whole time equivalent. So bigger organisations got a bit more. And then about 3 or 4 days before the launch, we then got told that social care was added in. So we didn't really factor in social care that much in our initial scoping. So what we're hoping to do this year, because this was money given from last year till April of this year, what we're hoping with this year for phase 2 is to weight it a bit more towards social care. So I'm working very closely with these organisations at the moment. Our phase of the programme now is sort of reaching delivery. So people have had the training. We're using a train the trainer model. And what will be happening is they will then start doing training sessions. So we're moving into delivery phase. We've got some dates for tier 1 and tier 2. Some trusts are going with tier 2 first, some are going with tier 1. And we'll be starting out the dates probably from about May, June. And it's a 3-year refresher programme. So from the date organisations start training, they kind of have a 3-year window to get all their staff trained. Very similar to other mandatory training, we'll be aiming for a 90–95% achievement rate. CQC inspected organisations can already be expected to be asked about what training they're providing. And I give guidance to organisations who aren't part of phase 1 yet, because to roll this out for the whole of the Northwest is going to take quite some time. But we do have some guidance and some steps for organisations who aren't part of the first phase, in order to sort of make sure that they can demonstrate to the CQC that they are sort of doing something in anticipation of Oliver McGowan. So, as I said, we're waiting for phase 1 to go into the delivery phase. We're going to continue. So we're doing project groups with people in phase 1 and soon phase 2. We're going to continue with our regional steering group. We've also top sliced the money, the original £1 million, for 3 ICB leads to lead on Oliver McGowan training and help expand the capacity of the training. And also, as we bring more people in, that there's a lead that kind of can coordinate the training rollout. And we're still awaiting for confirmation of how much will be given this year. Hopefully it's £1 million or maybe more. And we might be trialing a different approach for how we hand out the money for 23-24, but we will inform people via scoping. Thank you very much.
Wow, what an extraordinary overview there, David, and one that's really inspiring as well. And I think those of us who've not been lucky enough to get onto that training yet will probably be looking at for the next possible opportunity. I think it's absolutely vital and timely work for those of us working in mental health services. If there are any questions, and I suspect there are, I'm going to ask people to drop them into the chat as Christina and myself wind up this morning's session. But David, thanks again. And you may have got the graveyard slot, but your enthusiasm for this project absolutely carried it. So thank you for that. And thank you for maintaining the energy of the morning right up until the very end. So Christina, I'm going to just ask if you have any reflections on the morning or anything you wanted to pick up or reflect on.
I guess I was just maybe reflecting on the last hour or so. It seems like there's a lot of new things happening in the talking therapies world, which seems really, really exciting. So, even though kind of Kevin Jarman was able to, kind of let us know that the employment advisors isn't new as such, but there's a new upsurge of, investment and thinking about employment advisors. So that feels very, very, very important, very positive. But also to hear about, kind of the new training for autism and learning disabilities. And close to my own heart is, the new route for counsellors, the new therapeutic counselling degree. I'm a practitioner supervisor myself, so I'm always really interested to hear, about opportunities to increase the variety in our workforce so that we are offering our service users meaningful choice. And I think that links really well with the new guidance, new NICE guidelines for depression, which talk about the importance of kind of variety of offer and taking into account patient choice. You know, we know that there's lots of different therapies out there. There's more kind of there's more similarities between the therapies than there are differences. But, you know, we also know that for some, you know, for some service users, one therapy will suit them better, will suit their style better. So it feels like there's, you know, lots of things that feel like they're kind of coming together to you know, kind of increase our knowledge base, you know, to kind of understand the IAP services, thinking back to the presentations this morning, and also you know, just kind of new learning, new ways in all the time. So it feels like, yeah, absolutely loads, you know, really interesting morning, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I'm just gonna wrap up with one thing, really. And that's a reflection on the value of these half days, because I agree there's so much going on. And without this opportunity to come together and hear from national and regional leads on a variety of work streams, it would be impossible as a jobbing clinician, as I am, to actually keep up with these innovations. And Rhiannon, I just want to acknowledge the massive amount of hard work that went into pulling together such a good program today, and just recognise how valuable that is to those of us who just wouldn't see what was going on otherwise, and really appreciate that. Thanks to all our presenters for keeping us on time. We can finish at 1 for our lunch breaks. Did great, everybody, you did great. And just for being both informative and really engaging from 9:30 right the way through to 1. So thank you all very, very much for that. And well, I guess, Christina, we can wrap up the morning.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Good to see you all.
Take care.